This is a very timely video because we're actually in the process of planting our tomatoes, and we've kind of gone through what we have. So tomatoes are a great one to have fun with because you can collect different varieties. You can have ones for different purposes. You can have paste tomatoes and slicing tomatoes and cherry tomatoes and all these different things and keep it going, which is quite fun, and hence why there's so many types of tomatoes. This is going to be episode 3 of our Saving Seeds 101 series here, and this is kind of the first episode on really getting into the nitty-gritty on sort of planning out your garden with the purpose of saving seeds. And we kind of figured the best spot to start for this has to be tomatoes. Almost everybody grows them. There's a multitude, there's almost an infinite multitude of different varieties. Like this one here is our yellow pear-shaped tomato, which is actually part of our single seed challenge. As you can see, this little guy is doing really good. We had to restart it for a bit of a mishap. It had to do with the weediness of tomatoes. This is just one variety of many that we're going to grow this year. Now, tomatoes are interesting because technically there's 2 species of tomatoes. There's the tomato, common tomato, whatever common name you want to apply that to, and then there's the currant tomatoes. But the 2 are separate species, so this is kind of where it goes into genus and species. Hypothetically, you can keep a currant tomato and normal tomato. With tomatoes, the style, which is one of the female parts of the flower, on the currant tomatoes and a few others that I'll talk about in a moment, the style is quite long, and so what that allows is easy access to insects to spread the pollen around. Now, in the case of currant tomatoes, which I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on, there's not as many varieties. First point, they're not the same thing as cherry tomatoes. They are a different botanical species. And second point, if you have multiple types of currant tomatoes, they do have to be kept fairly far apart. The minimum recommendation is about 50 meters or 165 feet. As we go into the more normal garden variety tomatoes, that's where it gets a little more interesting because there's been a lot of different opinions on crossability between varieties over time. But in a nutshell, what it equates back to is the style length. So if a variety has a long style length, like the currant tomatoes, the different species we just talked about, then it will more freely cross with other tomatoes around it. If it has a short style length, or a really short style length, it's less likely to. And an interesting fact about sort of the common tomato, we're just going to call it common tomato, is the ancestors of the common tomato are more open pollinated, required the outcrossing to be really successful. They still set fruit, but they relied on that, which is a pretty common plant trait. But over time and through selection, these style lengths have gotten shorter, and there's some confusion as to whether it's just purposeful or just kind of happened over time. And what's essentially happened is the common tomato has become like an ideal inbreeding plant. And that's why when we go back to our single seed challenge, why we chose a tomato. Because we can take one tomato plant and we can save seeds from that one plant because the plant has no problem essentially with inbreeding. So that's an important point about tomatoes, is that you don't require a big population to maintain your variety. Essentially, the common tomato runs the gamut, depending on the variety, from quite open pollinating, which is typically, I think some of you may have heard me talk about potato-leaved varieties. Those are older cultivars generally, and they have longer styles, which means that they are more accessible to insects. But tomatoes run the gamut from those potato-leaf varieties that would still require a pretty decent separation distance of 50 meters or 165 feet or maybe more, depending on your environment, down to a lot of the more modern varieties. They can still be heirlooms, they can still be heritage, but a lot of the more modern, what we think of tomatoes, have really short style lengths to the point where they're almost 100% completely self-fertile. That flower will pollinate itself, basically. So when you get into the self-pollinating inbreeding type tomatoes, which the vast majority of the varieties are, a conservative separation distance of even 3 meters or about 10 feet is usually quite adequate. Now, another thing about tomatoes, they're native to the Americas, Central and South America. That being said, they're not the most attractive flowers to insects. The attractiveness to local pollinators, and that could be honeybees, it could be bumblebees, it could be any number of things, depending on your location, can affect your separation distances. So in the case of tomatoes, and this is why we would consider tomatoes to be an easy garden vegetable, despite all the information that I've just spewed out, as long as you know a little bit about the variety for your average gardener to save seeds from, because the vast majority of them are these self-fertile fertile plants. Tomatoes are kind of low on the priority for us as far as worrying too much about crossbreeding. That being said, can it happen? Yes, I think that's something you'll notice as we do this series. Can it happen unless you can 100% guarantee isolation? Yes, it can, but is it really likely to? And in the case of tomatoes, why we have them again is easy. It's not very likely. If you can keep them 3 meters apart or 10 feet apart from your varieties, you're pretty likely to have success maintaining those varieties for a very long time, which when you come back to a planting perspective, that's really nice and simple because you can have multiple varieties, and I've got a bunch of our varieties out in front of us, some that we've been growing for quite a few years, some that we're going to try. Tomatoes are a great one for experimenting because all you have to do is that little bit of planning. We have the yellow pear-shaped tomato from Gardening in the North, which of course is our single seed plant. We have our Black Prince, which is a darker tomato. We have another variety that's actually new to us, or relatively new to us, pineapple tomato. I think that's the full name. I have to double check that, but pineapple tomato. Another one that has really neat flavor and just a really neat tomato. And you're going to notice, and it's very pretty. You're going to notice the theme. We have kind of a little yellow pear tomato, kind of a sweeter one is our understanding. These Black Prince are kind of a dark burgundy type tomato, smaller. I always kind of joke they have like a bacon flavor, but not everybody notices that. They have a different flavor. These are, of course, well, kind of almost like a citrusy, pineapple-y type flavor, which is really neat. We're going to go with San Marzano, I never say that right, as kind of a, it's not a paste per se, but kind of a paste-ish type tomato, because we're
subbing out our Romas this year
for them.
We're going to try them this year instead of Romas.
Of course, we have our absolute staple, which has been our Scotia tomato, which is actually a Canadian variety developed in Nova Scotia, of all places. We have our, got upside down, our Gray's sweet cherry tomato, which is another one that we really, really were impressed with. It's a little red, super sweet cherry tomato. And then we have some new ones that we've received. So we're going to try these Palestine tomatoes. Never really tried them. They're kind of a beefsteak type, but supposed to be pretty good from what we were reading about them. Kind of bordering on the paste type again, which is kind of nice. These white Tomasol tomatoes, which
actually, oddly enough, after looking up, are actually yellow.
Yeah, kind of a yellowy color, which is kind of cool. Those actually came from us from Wild Edibles, which is awesome. So we're going to
part of the Canadian Seed Challenge.
Yes, part of the Canadian Seed Challenge, which is kind of fun. And so we're going to give them a try, and I know we've heard a lot of good things from people about them. And then we have these ones, these subarctic plenty tomatoes, which are another Canadian one.
We actually received these from Walsh Hills Homestead, which is practically a neighbor to us in the YouTube world. They're about half an hour away from us. So, yeah, we're very excited to try these early
and these ones sound interesting because they're fairly quick. They're a determinate and supposed to be pretty cold hardy. So that'll be kind of fun. Also wanted to mention another thing that I'm sure most of us know about tomatoes, and this doesn't look like it. I guess it doesn't kind of go that way. They're prolific seed producers. So even
when
the Scotias have a lot. This is our Gray's sweet cherry tomatoes, and this is all seeds saved from 2020. They produce a lot of seed, which is a nice thing when you're starting to seed save because it's a very simple process. So another little plus for tomatoes. Another little tip, and this is kind of a general tip for tomatoes. You've probably heard about either spraying tomatoes with water or shaking them. It's something that comes up occasionally when you're reading about growing tomatoes. And this is where there's overlap between growing and getting the product, the tomato, the fruit, and the seed saving. Because most tomato varieties are these self-fertile, short style type varieties, the shaking basically, because you don't have insects doing the work for you, the shaking basically helps the pollen spread around in the flower, which then generally equates to more fruit. Well, that more fruit also is your seeds. Well, we got everything planted. So
for the first round,
For the first round, we may plant a few more. But we planted 9 varieties, including the single seed. So that's pretty cool. Mm-hmm. And how many?
126 in total. It was 10 and a half dozen. Basically, the take home from this first segment, tomatoes are simple. One tomato can produce you enough seeds to
repopulate the world.
Feed your neighborhood. You don't need a huge spacing. 10 feet for the most part. You can go back and review all the little details that Chris said earlier about some of those other ones that are a bit more tricky. But as a general rule, most tomato plants need 10 feet.
Or 3 meters.
Or 3 meters in between each cluster
Which
of
is
type of
easy
variety.
to accommodate. Even though we have 9 varieties, we can make that work.
Exactly. And really, that's kind of it. Once we get to harvesting some of these, we'll come back with a video showing you just how to do it. I know
how to actually physically collect the seeds.
Some of it is basic, and a lot of people do know this information already, but we just kind of want to make sure we cover all the bases through this series. And tomatoes was a great way to start, because especially for anybody that's in the beginner phase of collecting seeds, tomatoes are a great way to start. There is not a lot that can go wrong.
A lot of the traits about tomatoes really work with the gardener, i.e., like all the things you said, you don't need a ton of space, they're quick, you don't even need a ton of plants, and you can keep something going. Hence why there's thousands and thousands of different kinds of tomatoes in the world.
Exactly.
There is still a chance that even when you use these separation distances, they could cross. But when it comes to tomatoes, and it comes to the varieties that have the really small styles, as we were talking about, which is the bulk of the tomato varieties, you're pretty safe to save at the small scale or backyard garden level, and be pretty sure that as long as you are keeping them that 3 meters apart, that you're going to get the same variety.
Another thing that should come back to, and this would go back to probably the last video in our little series here, episode 2, but make sure you're checking your packs. As Chris said, watch for them to be potato variety. Also watch for them to be a hybrid, because there are a lot of hybrid tomatoes out there, and if you haven't checked your packet, those doesn't mean you can't save seeds, but you're not guaranteed the same tomato next year.
You don't need a big distance. You can have fun with it. You can have many, many varieties. They have a low likelihood of crossing anyways. Some people do get away with them closer, but we're just saying 3 meters and you're pretty guaranteed you're good. Self-fertile, so you don't even need a big population size. I mean, and they want to populate the world. So everything about tomatoes really works.
They're verging on a weed.
They really,
so if you're thinking about collecting seed, go for it.
Yep.
Did you like my rhyme?
Start with, I did. Definitely give tomato seed collecting a try, because this has got to be the one vegetable that I usually say time and time again. I don't know why everybody doesn't do it. It's so simple. So anyways, on that note, stay tuned for the next episode where we'll go through another variety of vegetable.